Two imposters, posing as HOA officials, forced their way into James's home, threatening him and ransacking his belongings. They thought they could do whatever they wanted, hiding behind fake authority and intimidation. But what they didn't know was that this house had more than just a homeowner. It had a trained wolf, ready to defend it at all costs. And just wait until you hear how their little scheme turned into their worst nightmare, proving that justice has a way of biting back. Down. The evening had unfolded like any other in James Foster's quiet suburban neighborhood. The hum of lawnmowers had long since faded, children's laughter no longer echoed from the yards, and the occasional porch light flickered on as homeowners settled in for the night. A warm breeze drifted through the open window, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Inside, James sat comfortably on his couch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, the dim glow of a nearby lamp casting soft shadows along the walls. Then came the knock, loud, sharp, demanding. The abrupt sound shattered the evening calm, making James's hand pause midair as he reached for his phone on the coffee table. His brows knit together in confusion. He wasn't expecting anyone. The mail had already been delivered and he hadn't ordered takeout. Glancing at the clock, 7:42 p.m., he hesitated. Too late for a routine visit, too deliberate to be a neighbor stopping by. A strange unease crept into his chest as he placed his coffee down, the liquid inside rippling slightly from the sudden movement. Rising to his feet, he moved toward the door, his bare soles making almost no sound against the hardwood floor. His years of living alone had made him instinctively cautious. He reached the door but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he peered through the peephole. Two men stood on his front porch. Something about them sent a ripple of warning through his gut. They were dressed in dark navy uniforms that bore an unsettling resemblance to law enforcement attire, complete with cheap-looking badges pinned haphazardly to their chests. But James had lived here long enough to know his local officers, and these two weren't them. Their clothes were slightly wrinkled, their boots scuffed. They looked off, like a pair of actors wearing costumes that didn't quite fit. One of them, the taller of the two, had a lean, wiry frame and sharp, angular features. His eyes, cold and calculating, flicked toward the peephole, as if he somehow knew James was watching. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, a practiced, insincere expression that didn't reach his eyes. The second man was shorter but built like a battering ram, broad shoulders, a thick neck, and a shaved head that gleamed under the porch light. His arms were crossed over his chest, his stance rigid, predatory. Unlike his partner, he wasn't bothering to pretend. His expression was one of pure impatience, like a man ready to force his way in if words didn't do the trick. James's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed at him to ignore them, to lock the door and call the police. But the logical part of his mind told him to stay calm. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they really were with the HOA, though everything about their presence told him otherwise. Taking a steadying breath, he unlocked the door but only cracked it open slightly, keeping his foot planted firmly against the bottom edge to prevent them from pushing inside. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The taller man immediately took charge, stepping forward just enough for James to catch the faint scent of cheap cologne. He held up a manila folder, flipping it open with an air of importance. "We're representatives from the Homeowners Association," he announced, as if reading from a script. "You've violated community regulations. We need to inspect your property." James's eyes narrowed. Bullshit. The HOA didn't send people to conduct in-home inspections, especially not unannounced. If there was an issue, he would have received official documentation, not some vague accusation from two men who looked more like debt collectors than neighborhood administrators. Still, he kept his expression neutral. He knew better than to escalate things too quickly. "I haven't received any notices," he replied, his grip tightening on the edge of the door. "And you have no right to be here." The smirk on the taller man's face barely faltered, but there was a flicker of something else now. Annoyance? Amusement? It was hard to tell. He took a slow step closer, but James instinctively pressed the door inward, closing the gap slightly. That's when the bald man moved. Without hesitation, he lifted his heavy boot and jammed it into the door frame, stopping it from closing. A surge of adrenaline shot through James's veins. The force of the impact sent a sharp vibration up his arm, his grip slipping just enough for the door to push open an extra inch. Then, before James could react, the bald man shoved forward, using his full weight to slam the door open. James stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs as both men crossed the threshold. "Let's not make this difficult," the bald man sneered, stepping inside as if he owned the place. The taller man followed suit, closing the door behind them with an unsettling finality. James's breath came fast and shallow as he steadied himself, trying to process what had just happened. They were inside, and they weren't here for an inspection. The moment they stepped inside, the air in the room changed. It was no longer James's home, it was their hunting ground. Without hesitation, the two intruders spread out, moving with a chilling familiarity, as if they had done this dozens of times before. They weren't uncertain or hesitant. They weren't bluffing. They knew exactly what they were doing. The tall man moved first, striding over to the bookshelf by the TV. He ran his fingers along the spines of James's books, before suddenly knocking them off the shelf with one careless swipe. Hardcovers thudded against the floor, pages crumpling under their own weight. The bald man, meanwhile, moved toward the side table near the window. He pulled open drawers, rummaging through loose papers, slamming them shut without even looking at what was inside. The metallic clatter of keys and coins hitting wood made James flinch. His stomach tightened. "You have no right to be here," he barked, stepping forward, his fists clenched. The tall man barely spared him a glance before smirking. "We warned you," he said casually. Then, without a second thought, he reached for a framed photograph on the wall. James's breath hitched as he realized what it was. His parents' wedding photo, one of the last things he had of them. The tall man yanked it from its hook, studied it for half a second, then tossed it onto the couch as if it were nothing. The glass frame cracked upon impact. James felt something snap inside him. These men weren't just criminals. They weren't just here to rob him. They were here to take whatever they wanted, and they didn't care what they destroyed in the process. His knuckles turned white as his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to lunge at them, to fight back, but he forced himself to hold steady. Not yet. Then he heard something that sent ice down his spine. "Check for a safe." The words came from the bald one. His voice was low, casual, almost bored, like this was just another routine job for him. James's stomach twisted. So that was it. This wasn't about HOA rules. This wasn't about enforcing some ridiculous community violation. They were here for money. They had targeted his house. He felt his pulse quicken, a slow burn of rage bubbling beneath his skin. His fingers twitched with the urge to do something, anything. But he forced himself to stay still, to think. "Get out before I call the police," he growled, his voice dangerously low. For the first time, the bald man actually looked at him. And then he smiled. A slow, cruel smirk that made James's blood boil. "You won't have time," the man murmured. Then, as if to prove his point, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of black zip ties. James's breath caught. They weren't just here to rob him. They were planning to incapacitate him. Something deep, primal, and ancient roared to life inside of him. They thought they were in control. They thought they had the upper hand. They had no idea what was coming. A charged silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, like the calm before a storm. James stood motionless, his eyes locked on the two intruders, his breath steady despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface. He wasn't afraid, not anymore. The men thought they were in control. They had forced their way into his home, rummaged through his belongings like scavengers, and even threatened him. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. James tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Guys," he said, his voice eerily calm, "you've made a mistake." The tall man scoffed, the corner of his mouth curling into an arrogant smirk. He had no idea how badly things were about to turn for him. "Oh yeah," he mocked. "And what's that?" Then came the sound. A deep guttural growl rumbled through the air, low and primal. It wasn't loud, but it carried power, an ancient, untamed force that sent an instinctive chill down the spine. It wasn't human. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The bald man stiffened, his fingers twitching toward his belt. His breath hitched slightly, eyes darting toward the hallway. The tall man's smirk faltered. He was still trying to hold on to his false confidence, but there was something different in his posture now. His shoulders tensed, his stance stiffened ever so slightly, a subconscious reaction to danger. James saw it. He felt it. They knew. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, two glowing amber eyes emerged. Slowly, deliberately, Argos stepped into view. The dim light cast shadows along his thick, silver-gray coat, the powerful muscles beneath his fur shifting with each measured step. He moved like a specter, silent and fluid, his presence commanding. His ears were flattened against his head, his lips curled back to reveal sharp, ivory fangs, and the snarl vibrating in his throat was unlike anything a domestic dog could produce. It was a sound forged in the wild, a sound of pure, undiluted warning. Predator. James had seen his wolf like this only a handful of times before. Argos wasn't just protective. He was lethal when he needed to be. And right now, every instinct in his body was telling him that these men were a threat. The air grew heavy with tension. The bald man's breathing quickened. He moved first, fingers fumbling at his pocket, trying to grab something. James caught a glimpse of black plastic, a taser. He would never get the chance to use it. Argos exploded into motion, a blur of gray fur, a flash of white teeth, then impact. The force of the collision sent the bald man crashing onto his back, his weapon flying from his grip and skidding across the floor. He let out a choked yelp as he hit the hardwood, the breath driven from his lungs. But before he could react, before he could even attempt to move, Argos was on him. Massive paws pinned him down, pressing against his chest with bone-crushing pressure. The weight alone was paralyzing, but it was the wolf's snarl, deep, rolling, furious, that turned the man's fear into something much worse. Panic. The bald man lay frozen beneath the beast, his eyes wide, his lips trembling. He knew what would happen if he so much as twitched. Argos lowered his head, his fangs now hovering inches above the man's exposed throat. His breath came out in slow, heated puffs, stirring the fabric of the man's cheap uniform. One wrong move, and the wolf could tear out his jugular in less than a second. The tall man stumbled back, knocking into the coffee table as his brain finally caught up with the reality of the situation. He wasn't the one in control anymore. James turned to face him, the dim light casting sharp angles across his face. The man's cocky expression had vanished entirely. His pupils were blown wide, his jaw slightly slack, the adrenaline of fear flooding his system. "You still feeling in charge?" James asked, his voice cold and level. The tall man didn't answer, because he finally understood. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. The room was deathly silent, except for the low, menacing growl reverberating from deep within Argos's chest. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a reminder, a declaration that the moment either of these intruders so much as twitched, consequences would follow. James stood calmly, his heartbeat steady, as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His fingers didn't shake, nor did he feel the slightest bit of hesitation. This was already over. 911? What's your emergency? He cast a glance at the bald man pinned beneath Argos's enormous frame. His face was twisted in sheer terror, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He was trying not to move, barely even daring to blink, afraid that even the smallest motion might trigger the wolf's fury. James let the moment stretch a little longer before finally answering. "I have 2 intruders in my home. They forced their way in. One of them is restrained." He paused, flicking his gaze toward the tall man who was now backed into the corner of the room, his hands slightly raised, his chest rising and falling in panicked breaths. "The other one isn't going anywhere either." The dispatcher's voice came back immediately. "Are you safe?" James exhaled slowly, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile. "Oh yeah, I'm safe." The response must have thrown the dispatcher off because there was a brief pause on the other end before she continued. "Officers are en route. Stay on the line." "That won't be necessary," James interrupted, his voice as steady as ever. He ended the call. The tall man swallowed hard. Look, man, we can... James had lifted a single finger, silencing him instantly. Not another word. The minutes stretched on, though the tally felt longer for the men who now realized how completely they had lost control. The bald one made a noise in his throat, somewhere between a whimper and a plea, but he didn't dare move. His pulse was visible in his neck, hammering away like a drumbeat. James merely folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. Outside, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night. The moment the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, the reality of their situation sank in for the intruders. The bald man squeezed his eyes shut, while the tall one clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching, as if he was still trying to think of a way out. But there wasn't one. Within moments, heavy boots pounded against the pavement, doors slammed, and authoritative voices filled the night. "Police! Open up!" James didn't need to move. The door was already slightly ajar from when the men had forced their way inside. He simply tilted his head in their direction and called out, "Come on in, officers. The party's already over." 3 uniformed officers entered, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters. But the moment they took in the scene before them, their posture shifted. One of them, a grizzled man with short, graying hair, arched a brow as he took in the sight of Argos looming over the bald man, his teeth still bared. The younger officer beside him let out a low whistle. "Well," the older cop said, amusement lacing his tone, "that's not something you see every day." One of the officers strode forward, gripping the tall man by the arm and twisting him around before slapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. "You've got the right to remain silent," he began, but the tall man barely heard him. His face was set in a look of stunned disbelief, his mouth pressed into a tight, furious line. The bald man, still flat on his back, finally let out a shaky breath. Can you call off the wolf?" he stammered, his voice hoarse. James raised a brow, considering it for a moment. Then with a small nod, he gave the command. "Argos, off." Instantly, the massive wolf lifted his paws from the man's chest and took a slow, deliberate step back, though his golden eyes remained locked on his target. His snarl faded into silence, but his presence alone was still enough to make the intruder flinch. The bald man scrambled to his knees, only to have one of the officers yank his arms behind his back and cuff him as well. As the officers led the 2 men toward the door, one of them shook his head. "These 2 have been running a fake HOA scam," he explained, tightening the cuffs on the tall man. "They've been breaking into homes for weeks, pretending to be association reps, targeting people who live alone." He cast a knowing glance at James. "Guess they picked the wrong house this time." James let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, you could say that." As the men were led out onto the porch, the bald one hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting back to the massive creature now sitting calmly beside James. The officer following behind him caught the look and smirked. "What? Didn't like meeting the neighborhood watch?" The younger officer, the one who had whistled earlier, let out a small laugh and gave Argos an approving nod. "That's one hell of a guard dog," he said. James chuckled, glancing down at his companion. Argos simply let out a huff and trotted back toward the living room, his tail flicking behind him as if nothing had happened. James smiled. "He's not a dog." The officers exchanged glances, some of them shaking their heads in disbelief as they escorted the criminals into the waiting patrol cars. James closed the door behind them, exhaling slowly. The house was quiet again, just as it had been before the chaos unfolded. But this time, the silence wasn't tense. It was satisfying. Justice had been served. And James had never been prouder of his wolf.